Hello everyone, and welcome to this lecture tonight. It was originally intended to be part of our Cold War series. It is the penultimate lecture in that series, as we have Tom Hopkins speaking on Coastal Command in the Cold War at the start of next month. We also have a lecture as part of our Trenchard series next week. But I'm delighted that tonight we have Alan Jackson joining us. He's going to talk about the V-Force in the early years. But I'm really pleased as well about the lecture series being online. I know a number of you will probably have joined us for our earlier ones. And it's a good opportunity to say that these lectures will continue in 2021, and our call for papers is now online. If you visit the RAF Museum's news section, and for those of you who have used our website, you'll know how amazing it is. It's in the About Us section for each site. You can find that call for papers, or you can also email me at harry.rafal@rafmuseum.org to have an informal conversation if you are interested in presenting a paper as part of our series. And as I say, delighted tonight to have Alan Jackson with us. And I'm also equally pleased he's got a huge audience. We've got over 185 people currently live with us, joining from far afield as Saskatoon, Switzerland, and even Swindon, which is a personal delight. So, Alan is a King's College research student doing a PhD which examined Britain's V-Force and its operational effectiveness in the strategic nuclear deterrent role, and the extent to which this modifies our understanding of the concept of control of the air. He's supervised by Christine Golter and David Jordan. He's the past winner of the Royal Air Force Museum's Master Prize for his dissertation examining the British government decision on the bomber-borne nuclear deterrent during the early Cold War years. And research from his dissertation was subsequently published in the RAF Centre for Air Power Studies journal, the Air Power Review. So, without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Alan. His video is now on, and I'm going to focus on him. And, take it away, Alan.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, good evening, everyone. And it's nice to have such a big turnout. My talk today arises out of my current research as a PhD candidate in the Defence Studies, as Harry said, at King's. And my thesis concerns the effectiveness of the British strategic nuclear deterrent during the period when the responsibility for it fell on the Royal Air Force and its fleet of V-bombers. Today I shall look at the period up to 1960, the point at which the B-2 variants of the Vulcan were starting to be delivered to operational squadrons, and conversion of the B-1 Vulcans to the B-1A standard had just begun. Because I've only about 40 minutes this evening, I shall not be able to cover all of the ground that I envisaged when this talk was planned back in December last year. But let's get underway. Here's a quick outline of the topics I shall cover this evening. I shall emphasize the challenge of defending against Soviet strike capabilities in order to get the V-Force successfully on its way to its targets. And I shall look at a few of the challenges faced in getting to those targets. First, though, a quick look at the economic and political background to the government decisions which led to a British strategic nuclear deterrent. It was an immense challenge. As you see from the figures here, almost 20% of the British population was engaged for much of 1945 in the prosecution of the Second World War. For the British economy to recover post-war, the great majority of those people needed to find jobs which expanded the productive capacity of the nation. Human and material resources needed to be thrown into increasing exports and reducing imports. Those needs were antithetical to the creation of the British deterrent, which demanded many scarce resources. And yet, the bomb and the bombers were specified and initial orders placed during the immediate post-war Attlee government. And this despite the American McMahon Act, which prevented the continuation of joint nuclear research and development. The thinking about the requirement for high-flying jet bombers had begun in 1944. Interestingly, in that year, Charles Portal, who was Chief of the Air Staff, responded to the Assistant Chief of the Air Staff for training that he hoped that the aim for the fast and high-flying, high-altitude next generation of bomber would be a cruising altitude of 60,000 feet. And that's pretty much where we got to eventually. Specification B 1446 was created to cover the Short Brothers SA-4 Sperrin, on which work had started in 1945. The Sperrin was a conservative design and did not proceed to production, though the two prototypes participated in valuable research and testing work, including on the development of the Blue Danube bomb casing, until the aircraft were withdrawn from use in 1957 and 1958. And here is the Sperrin. To me, it certainly has a look of the past rather than the future. Specification B 3546 for more advanced bombers was issued in January 1947, and responses were received from 6 manufacturers. Of these, contracts were issued to Handley Page for the Type 80, which became the Victor, and to A.V. Rowe for the Type 698, which became the Vulcan. In 1948, de Havilland proposed a bomber, the DH-111, based on the DH-106, the Comet. This wasn't taken up. Recognition that the performance of the Sperrin was inadequate led to the issue of specification B948 for an insurance bomber, lest the technical advances required in the Victor and Vulcan proved too challenging. The answer to this was the Vickers Type 660, the Valiant, which bore a striking resemblance to the Vickers proposal for B3546. And here are the discarded B3546 offers. First, the English Electric proposal, and then that from Short Brothers with a front fuselage similarity to the Sperrin, but very different in all other departments. The Vickers Armstrong pitch, to which the Valiant appeared externally so similar. And finally, the Armstrong Whitworth design. It's interesting to see where the United Kingdom stood compared with the USA and the USSR in the early years of the Cold War in its path to the creation of the British strategic nuclear deterrent. I've highlighted here in blue the progress of the United States, Russia, and Britain in successfully testing their first fission weapons. In red, their first truly practical weapons delivery systems. I've suggested here that the B-47 was the first practical American system rather than the earlier B-36. And finally, in purple, their first fusion devices. And overall, you can see that we were some way behind. And that, of course, not least because of the McMahon Act, which meant that we had virtually a complete restart on the bomb research. And for anybody who hasn't seen it, here's a copy of the single sheet of paper, which on the 9th of August 1946 set out the operational requirement for the first British atomic weapon, which would emerge as Blue Danube. And of course, August 1946 was well before political approval was given for the development of the weapon. There were many improvements to deterrent capability which were expected of the following years, but which never made it into service. These were mostly attempts to extend the effective life of the bombers, Blue Steel 2 and Skybolt, for example, or to replace them like Blue Streak and a supersonic bomber. It's worth remembering that the Aeronautical Research Council had work done on the possibility of a supersonic bomber as early as 1947. Also worth remembering that Sir Henry Tizard's Committee on the Future Weapons and Methods of War looked at ballistic missile delivery of warheads in June 1945, at a time when the committee had no knowledge of the Manhattan Project, but of course at a point where Britain had been subjected to attack by both the V1 and the V2 weapons in the Second World War. Later in 1945, Leonard Cheshire VC, who had been a British observer on the Nagasaki mission, expressed the view to Prime Minister Attlee that the ballistic missile would be the principal means to deliver atomic weapons to their targets, and that, and I quote him, "at all costs, Britain should initiate its own space program." Duncan Sands, responsible for the 1957 Defence White Paper, had been closely involved in government with the German missile threat towards the end of the Second World War. He was, of course, a rocket man. though his plan to replace the bombers with the Blue Streak medium-range ballistic missile did not come to pass. This is the Blue Streak, which survives at the RAF Spade Adam electronic warfare range. That said, missiles would in 1969 replace the bombers in the shape of the submarine-launched Polaris. But today we're here to talk about the bombers and some of the factors which would bear on their operational effectiveness. So to finish this section, here's the original supersonic bomber that we didn't get, the Avro 730, cancelled at the time of the 1957 Defence White Paper. The aircraft was originally specified for reconnaissance, intended to survey the damage done by a first strike before final target selection for a second strike. That concept of operation had been rendered obsolete by the introduction of the thermonuclear weapon. Moving on, we come to threats to the deterrent on the ground and in its home airspace. Self-evidently, to get to the bombers to their targets, it would first have been necessary to get them airborne and on their way before they could be destroyed on the ground or over UK territory by a Soviet strike. To be effective, the strategic nuclear deterrent was not just about the bombers and the weapons that they carried. Many aspects beyond the bombers were involved. These graphs show a partial view of the buildup of Soviet nuclear strike capabilities from 1955 onwards. On the left, the number of delivery systems available year by year, and on the right, the number of nuclear warheads, with the pale blue at the bottom being the bombers, the darker blue being ballistic missiles launched from the land, and the green being submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The data here, incidentally, are mainly from the very useful Russian Strategic Nuclear Forces, published in English in 2001 and edited by Pavel Podvig. The original edition in Russian came out in 1998 and interestingly was subsequently suppressed in Russia, with the copies being withdrawn and destroyed. I mentioned that this is a partial view, importantly as regards strikes against the United Kingdom. It includes only bombers categorized by Podvig as strategic. Those bombers were the Tupolev Tu-95 and 95K and the Myasishchev 3M. So very significant threats to V-Force operations like the Tupolev Tu-16 are omitted. In S.J. Ball's very useful 1995 book, The Bomber in British Strategy, he stated that, and I quote, "The Air Ministry estimated in 1955 that by 1960, Russia would have had enough nuclear forces to simultaneously attack the United States and the United Kingdom, with about 450 bombers allocated to each. There were thought to be 150 airfields from which such attacks could be launched, and that this number would rapidly increase in the future. Although it was argued in that era of counterforce nuclear doctrine that all these bases would have to be destroyed within a few hours, it was obvious that such a mission was already beyond Bomber Command. It would be unable to mount the necessary number of missions in one strike." And that's the end of the quotation. Rightly or wrongly, that estimate in 1955 must have given pause to senior levels of government if it reached that far. By way of example of Soviet striking power as it developed over the second half of the 1950s and the 1960s, the next slide shows a timeline of missile capabilities. The chart shows the development of Soviet land attack missile capabilities over the period from 1955 to 1969. Range in kilometers is on the x-axis, and the year of service entry is on the y-axis. The area of each spot represents the theoretical yield of the warhead carried. The red spots are for land-based ballistic missiles. The blue spots are for air-launched standoff missiles, what we would now call cruise missiles. And the green spots are for submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The data here are again mainly from Pavel Podvig. It's important to stress that this view of capabilities and that shown in the previous slide have the benefit of hindsight. And with that benefit, we can see from this chart and the previous one that had the Soviet Union chosen to use some of its nuclear striking power against the United Kingdom, a significant threat from bombers existed before the V-Force became operational with nuclear weapons, and was enhanced as standoff weapons were introduced into service. We can also see that there was a realistic threat from land-based missiles with megaton warheads from 1960 onwards, and a realistic threat from submarine-launched missiles existed from late 1961 onwards. So for the period we're looking at today, the USSR had the capability by 1950 line to launch a supersonic standoff missile, the KH-20, from a high-performance turboprop bomber, the Tupolev Tu-95, from a range of perhaps as much as 500 miles, carrying a warhead with a yield around 2 megatons. This range is important, as we will see when we come to look at Fighter Command's ability to defend the bomber bases. The KH-20, incidentally, was a MiG design, owing a great deal to the I-7U experimental fighter, which lay on MiG's development path between the MiG-21 and the MiG-23. Also by 1959, the Soviets possessed a ballistic missile, the R-12, with a range of about 1,300 miles. That's enough to get from the Moscow area to the East Anglian bomber airfields, and with a 2.3 megaton warhead. There was also a growing capability, initially pretty crude, to launch missiles from submarines. The earliest of these, the R-11FM, which could be launched only from a surface submarine, was in service from 1956, carried a 10 kiloton warhead, and had a range of a little over 100 miles. So now moving on to air defense against these threats. In 1954, it was already recognized at the highest levels in the Royal Air Force that it would take a long time before any effective air defense could be fielded against bomber attacks on the UK. Here's a paragraph from a paper written for the Chief of the Air Staff, then Sir William Dixon, which makes the position clear. The paper, dated the 30th of April 1954, considering the implications for the RAF and the country of the megaton bomb, the fusion weapon. The report was copied to the Secretary of State for Air, so its bleak conclusions were known at a senior ministerial level. And as it says, an adequate air defense system could not be available for at least another 10 years. By the end of 1954, the Chiefs of Staff had concluded and recommended that the primary role of Fighter Command should be the protection of Bomber Command from surprise attack. And this conclusion was admitted to the public in the 1957 Defence White Paper. We need to look at what defences we had against the Soviet threat in the early years of the V-Force. Any attack would need to be blunted to ensure successful launch of the bombers. Dividend was the major UK air defence exercise of 1954. I refer to it here because it provides a good picture of the RAF's air defence capability at the beginning of the V-bomber era. Remember that by the end of 1954, the Boeing B-47 on the American side, the Myasishchev M4 and the Tupolev Tu-16 were all in service. The first V-bomber squadron, 138, with Valiants, formed on the 1st of January 1955. The scale of exercise Dividend may be judged from the typical size of the force airborne at any one time for attacks against the United Kingdom. A post-exercise analysis by Bomber Command's Operational Research Branch gave this as 668 aircraft of 17 different types. These ranged from Fairey Fireflies, a Second World War piston engine type, to jet fighters. 345 of the total participants in the attacking forces were F-86 Sabres or F-84 Thunderjets, and jet bombers, 60 Canberras in a typical raid, and 6 B-47s. The defenders were a mixed bunch. Fighter Command's order of battle was reported as totaling 881 aircraft. Vampires, Meteors, day and night fighter versions, Sabres, and a handful of Hunters. Not yet in routine operational service, the Hunters came from the Air Fighting Development Squadron at West Raynham. 146 Meteor night fighters, NF-11s and NF-12s, and 12 Venom NF-2s were equipped with airborne intercept radars. The remainder, not so equipped, were directed to targets using ground radars. In 1954, none of the fighters was yet equipped with air-to-air missiles. There were no surface-to-air missiles in service. The discovery that carcinotron jammers would render the period's Type 80 radars largely ineffective had not yet surfaced in the official mind. Looking at the most modern types among the attacking forces bombers, these were the Canberras and the B-47s. Of the Defenders, the Hawker Hunter. Fighter Command's research branch reported an interception success rate for the Hunters against the jet bombers in daylight of just 31%. And that was against raid aircraft mainly flying at suboptimal altitudes below 40,000 feet. Photographic reconnaissance camera sorties, flown probably at 46,000 feet, were not intercepted. Because there were so few Hunters available at the time, just 5 aircraft took part in the exercise. The statistics may present an unfair picture, but they are indicative of the parlous state of the UK's air defences at the beginning of the V-Force era. Here we see a paragraph from the report by the then AOC and Sea Fighter Command and later Chief of the Air Staff, Dermot Boyle. The chances of pre-coast interception by existing fighters by day and by night at very, very high and very low altitudes, he wrote, are marginal, if not impossible. The swept-wing fighter reference is to the Hunters. He seems to have taken an optimistic view of that research branch report. In 1956, the results of Exercise Stronghold were not much better. Here's a clip from the equivalent report. The AOC and Sea Fighter Command by now was Tom Pike, another future CAS. The chances of a defensive Hunter intercepting a Hunter of the attacking force pre-coast were just 15%. There were, of course, important developments which improved our air defence capabilities and therefore the chances of getting the V-Force airborne and en route in the event of a surprise attack. And it must be said that the assumption at the time was that there was likely to be a period of strategic warning and that a bolt from the blue was unlikely. And it was also thought that an attack by the Soviet Union was unlikely to come for some years. In terms of control and reporting, the deficiencies in the system as it stood were considered by the Cabinet Defence Committee early in 1953. A Chiefs of Staff paper on air defence had noted that our present control and reporting system has serious weaknesses in many important directions. The development of the rotor control and reporting system followed, with its radar stations, dedicated telephone network, and deep bunkers for ground-controlled intercept and sector operations rooms. After immense expense, it came into operational use from 1956 onwards, but it was soon recognised that something better was required. Incidentally, it's worth noting that in 1955, the 7 radar stations in the sector covering eastern England were manned only from half an hour before dawn until half an hour after sunset, and this only on weekdays. And during the same hours, there were just 4 armed fighters held at 15 minutes' notice. Recognition of the inadequacies came alongside continual Treasury budget cutting, so improvements with the less easily jammed Type 85 radars were not fully operational until 1968, with a much reduced network from that envisaged in the RAF's 1958 Plus and Plan Ahead schemes. The linesman system which followed, still using the Type 85 radar, did not come into use until 1974, well after the strategic bomber era. A degree of naval airborne early warning was instituted using radars mounted initially on Fleet Hour-armed Douglas Sky Raiders and then on Fairey Gannets. Those radars were later installed in Avro Shackletons, but that was not until 1972. The ballistic missile early warning system at Fylingdales became operational early in 1964. The all-weather fighters which followed the night fighter Meteors and Venoms into service were the Gloucester Javelin in service from 1956, early in 56, and the first operational English Electric Lightning Squadron, 74, formed in June 1960. The Bristol for anti-Bloodhound Mark I was the RAF's first surface-to-air missile, which entered service trials in 1958. It was not until the introduction of the Mark II version of the missile into service in 1964 that the RAF had a reasonably capable weapon. The Fairey Fireflash, the first RAF air-to-air missile, was accepted into RAF service in May 1957. It was a beam-riding missile and had a range of 3,500 meters. The de Havilland Firestreak with infrared homing followed soon afterwards. It had a range of up to 6,400 meters. Firestreak was followed by the de Havilland, later Hawker Siddeley Dynamics, Red Top, faster and with greater range, and retaining an infrared seeker in service from 1964. Finally, on air defence, here's a Bloodhound picture. For a report on 2 flight trials in 1957, it shows a trial round. The photograph was taken from the port wing camera pod of the target aircraft. The missile passed 4 feet from the target's wingtip. Had the missile had a live warhead with a proximity fuse, it would presumably have destroyed the target. This looks promising. However, the target was a Fairey Firefly, flying across the range at 150 knots and 14,000 feet. Not much of a challenge, one might think, compared with the Tu-16 head-on at full chat with electronic countermeasures. Finally, in this section, here is a chart from a July 1958 Central Fighter Establishment report on the employment of manned fighters in the defence of the UK. Interception data were taken from the air defence exercises that we've covered, together with the 1957 exercise Vigilant, in which javelins were used. The data shown here relate to night Canberra raids. Note 2 things. The vertical access gets nowhere near to 100%. The 1954 report showed that just 18 of 123 Canberras were intercepted at night before the coast. So the point at which the yellow line here crosses the vertical axis at the coast, the percentage intercepted was just 14.6. And the zero interception point occurs between 80 and 90 nautical miles offshore. Remember that the practical range of Bloodhound 2 from launch point to kill was less than that, and that the range of the KH-20 cruise missile, which we met earlier, was a great deal more than that. The existence and range of the KH-20 seemed not to have been appreciated at the time. The report stated that UK intelligence believed that the range of the Soviet cruise missile carried by the Tu-16 was only 50 miles, and the report made no mention of the Tu-95K. It perhaps goes without saying that Britain has never had an active defence against incoming ballistic missiles. Such a defence was much discussed in this period, including a developed Bloodhound with a nuclear warhead, but nothing came near achieving a decision to proceed. So, moving on to readiness. And we've only got time for one example this evening, and this relates to potential logistical problems in maintaining adequate readiness levels. We can look at 2 documents on this, which I had released under the Freedom of Information Act. And here's the first one. As you can see, this one had the classification top secret. Actually, it's not very clear, but it does say top secret atomic, UK eyes only at the top. This related to the operational readiness of the Yellow Sun Mark I weapon. This was the Yellow Sun casing with the green grass warhead, a pure fission device. Unhelpfully, the date of the document is not shown. However, of its addressees, Grandy was ACAS operations from the 17th of October 1958, and Kyle was ACAS operational research until the 20th of September 1959. So the document has to fall between those 2 dates. Green grass, many of you I'm sure will be aware, was apparently tricky to handle. Its fragile core was filled with steel ball bearings until it was armed. The times quoted here of up to 92 minutes to arm and load 4 aircraft under field conditions suggest that this was not a weapon which was usable in the absence of a considerable warning period. Here we have the first part of an earlier document, also classified top secret atomic. The part that is being released is undated, but it states that the interim megaton weapon was soon to be delivered to the Royal Air Force. This was almost certainly Violet Club, comprising the green grass warhead in the blue Danube casing. As you can see, for a number of reasons, the weapon was deemed unsuitable for overseas deployment. And here's the rest of the page. The reference just to Valiant and Vulcan suggests that this document was pre-formation of the first Victor Squadron in April 1958. And the reference here on the second page to Butterworth being ready by May 1958 shows that the minute was definitely written before that. The first delivery of Violet Club to the Royal Air Force took place in March 1958, so that appears to confirm that this was the interim weapon referred to. As a sidelight, it struck me as interesting that the venerable Hastings was still being used for transporting essential equipment for atomic weapons. The jet-powered Vickers V1000 had been cancelled in 1955, and the Bristol Britannia didn't enter service with the Royal Air Force until 1959. Moving on now to some topics about getting the bombers to their targets. We tend to think of the V-Force move from high-level to low-level attack as beginning in 1963. This map comes from a paper dated the 10th of March 1955, which considered low-level capabilities of the V-bombers. The paper noted that, and I quote, the V-bombers were essentially designed for high altitude, and on this basis, a number of design concessions were allowed in order to achieve the best possible performance. It is therefore not surprising if at low level they will be subjected to severe limitations. And these limitations were to speed, range, and maneuvering G limits. The paper raised the possibility of flying much of the route on 2 engines, and even of making the return journey, if there was one, on 1 engine to increase range. Hence this map, which I'm afraid may be difficult to read if you're using a smaller screen than mine. It shows, using Moscow as the target, the distances from which the V-bombers could operate under 3 schemes. First, if you look at the left-hand text box towards the top left-hand corner of the page, and the 3 arrowed rings, the rings that are arrowed from it, these show the maximum distance at which each type must be air refueled to full overload en route in order to allow the last 650 nautical miles to and from the target to be flown at low level, defined here as 1,000 feet, on 2 engines only. It is interesting to see that in 1955, the Victor was expected to be able to use that profile if topped off with fuel only 50 nautical miles after leaving its base. Next, the smaller text box near the top of the page on the left-hand side. This shows the maximum radius from which each type could fly the whole mission at low level, again on just 2 engines, without in-flight refueling. For the Victor and Vulcan, these distances were expected to be almost the same, 960 and 950 nautical miles, respectively, from Moscow. Here, the black dots on the map in Germany, Denmark, and Norway are interesting. They show the locations of Allied airfields with runways capable of handling the V-bombers, those with runways of at least 2,000 yards in length. About 20 of those were within 960 nautical miles of the target. For the Valiant, just 3 in the extreme east of Denmark. Finally, in the right-hand box near the top of the page towards the right side of the chart, this scenario was based on flying from UK bases, initially at high level, like the first scenario, but this time without in-flight refueling. This shows the distances from Moscow at which each type was expected to be able to descend to fly the final sector at low level. These distances were for the Victor 470 nautical miles, for the Vulcan 315 nautical miles, and for the Valiant 25 nautical miles. The distances under each of these three schemes appear to have taken no account of any need for tactical manoeuvring en route. And these matters were taken seriously at high level in the Royal Air Force. The Chief of the Air Staff was aware of similar numbers for the first option, at least by January 1955, and the matter had been discussed as early as 1954. It's important to remember at this point that the V-Force had no tanker fleet in prospect at that time. That didn't happen until there were sufficient Vulcans and Victors in service to allow the release of Valiants for conversion to the tanker role. The two Valiant tanker squadrons were operational only from April 1962, and the replacement Victor tankers from 1965. A later 1955 report entitled The Operational Effectiveness of the V-Bombers looked, amongst other matters, at expected performance of the bombers in succeeding years. And of course, their performance was gradually improved, and very much so with the B-2 versions of the aircraft. This chart from that 1955 report reveals the importance in evading Soviet defenses then attached to improving the height at which the bombers could operate. The operating altitude increase expected to be achieved by successive planned modifications to the Vulcan and Victor is shown on the y-axis over the time period shown on the x-axis. Perhaps building on the earlier 1955 report, this report also referred optimistically to the alternative of low-level attack supported by in-flight refueling. The only drawback mentioned in this report was how to deliver the weapon at low altitude. If that problem were solved, and I quote, "successful low-level night operations might be conducted even after 1962 due to the limitations in defence at these heights." It's worth remembering the service entry date for the Valiant tankers of April 1962 in this context. It's also worth noting that one of the assumptions in the report was that the Soviets had no surface-to-air guided weapon capability at that time. In fact, Moscow had been defended since early in 1955 by a ring of missile sites. When fully developed, 56 sites with 60 missiles each. These S-25 system missiles, NATO designation SA-1 Guild, were admittedly less capable than the later S-75 Divina system, NATO SA-2 guideline, full-scale deployment of which began in 1958. But remarkably, the S-25 system remained in service into the 1980s. And incidentally, here's what an approaching Vulcan looks like at 500 feet. The aircraft was 8 miles away from me and flying at 180 knots. At that speed, it took the Vulcan 2 minutes and 20 seconds to reach me. Roy Brocklebank has stated that the final planned speed to the target in the 1960s low-level era was 350 knots. So under actual conditions in a similar landscape and clear weather, it seems that a suitably positioned surface-to-air missile site, if there were one, would have had just over 2 minutes to launch missiles if relying just on visual identification at perhaps 10 miles range before the target had passed out of view behind the missile launch point. The subject of Soviet surface-to-air missile defenses was addressed in a June 1956 paper. That paper was informed by a Joint Intelligence Committee assessment of the likely extent of the Soviet air defense system in 1960. This map shows the expected extent of surface-to-air guided weapon coverage by 1960, defined by the yellow circles, as perhaps can better be seen in this partial enlargement. The coverage was expected to be extensive, and of course there would also be many fighters. The combination of surface-to-air missiles and all-weather supersonic fighters was by 1960, and again I quote from the 1955 report, likely to be able to provide a reasonably effective defence against deep penetration raids, except those made at low level in poor visibility. We know from the U-2 shootdown in May 1960 that this was a pretty accurate forecast as regards high-flying aircraft. The paper went on to suggest, and I quote, that the loss rate for Valiants operating by day at high level will be so high that this type of operation will be out of the question, and that operated at low level, the fatigue life of the Valiant was assessed by Vickers using civil airline criteria at 75 hours. One wonders what that figure would have been had they known then about the wing spar problem, which grounded the whole fleet of Valiants in January 1965. Later in the paper, it was noted, and I quote again, in studying the problem of extending the Valiant operational life, it had become apparent that the Vulcans and Victors are also likely to run into serious trouble in 1960. The paper recommended, and I quote, that the proposal to operate the Valiant at low level be dropped and effort be concentrated on ensuring that the Vulcans and Victors can carry out this task. It's worth at this point taking a step back in time, looking at how the road ahead looked in terms of weapon delivery systems in December 1954. This chart appeared as an appendix to a minute from Air Vice Marshal Satterley, then ACAS operational requirements. The purpose of the chart was to illustrate the gap between the point at which the V-bombers were expected to lose their effectiveness and the point at which the proposed medium-range ballistic missile, Blue Streak, might become available. Satterley's minute was dated the 20th of December 1954. In essence, the medium bombers were thought to be safe if they were operating outside the two red lines on the y-axis. That gives the height concerned. Above the upper one and below the lower one. Soviet air defences, it was then thought, would only be effective between those two red lines. And as you can see, that gap was expected to start in 1960 at the point where the upper red line rises vertically with the assumed introduction of Soviet surface-to-air missiles. And in the absence of other measures, to last until the introduction of the medium-range ballistic missile, then assumed to be Blue Streak, and to occur in 1969, and indicated by the horizontal blue bar up in the top right-hand corner of the chart. Satterley thought that the effective life of the V-Force might be extended into the mid-1960s. It's interesting to note that three of the means of extending that life, and shown on the chart, have been abandoned between the initial preparation of the chart and its use as an appendix to the minute. They're the ones highlighted by the blue dashed arrows and the text in the blue outline box. Satterley wanted to fill the gap with the bomber derivative 20R336 of the planned supersonic reconnaissance aircraft to operational requirement 330. This was the Avro 730, which we saw earlier. Satterley remained a strong supporter of that aircraft against strong internal opposition within the Air Force until its cancellation in the 1957 Defence White Paper. Finally, a few concluding thoughts. What I hope I've illustrated today is that despite the great achievements of the politicians, the scientists, the industrialists, and the Royal Air Force in creating by 1957 an operational British strategic nuclear deterrent, there was a high level of concern within the Royal Air Force about the effectiveness of the V-Force. That concern existed from well before initial operating capability was achieved and increased in the early years of operation. And here we see a formal official communication. For those who may not be familiar with the format, note the "Sir, I am directed to state" at the beginning of the minute, and "I am, sir, your obedient servant" at the end. The letter is from ACAS Operations to the AOC&C Bomber Command, and it's dated the 13th of May, 1960. It gives a flavour of that concern. CAS at the time was Sir Thomas Pike, in post since the 1st of January, 1960. The Bomber Command Chief, Sir Kenneth Cross, had been in post for just under a year. The letter draws attention to the Soviet possession of intermediate-range ballistic missiles, of which perhaps only 3 minutes tactical warning would be given once the Fylingdale station came into operation 3 years thence, and also to the difficulty of penetration of Soviet airspace with its fighter and increasing surface-to-air missile defences. Well, at this point, my time is up, so I will stop there. I've still got a lot of research to do before I can complete my thesis, so I'm hoping I may be able to come back on another occasion and give you some brighter news about the later period. I will now welcome your questions, comments, and perhaps differences of view. So, Harry, I'll now stop sharing my screen and hand back to you for questions and so on.
You're so proficient, Alan. I was expecting to have to unfocus your screen for you, and you lost it. I say I'm going to let you catch your breath for a second, and I can tell our audience. But if they'd like to ask a question to you, they can do so using the Ask a Question function at the bottom of the screen. We've got a few questions already. Before we get into those, I should say that we have our next lecture at 6 p.m. on Thursday, the 19th of November. Our Trenchard lectures in air power, which are held with Royal Aeronautical Society, and you can do that. You can follow that by joining our Crowdcast stream. Also, just up to date is our Cold Waters RAF Coastal Command in the early stages of Cold War, which is going to be delivered by our curator in Cosford, Tom Hopkins. So both are really exciting lectures. The one on Thursday is Forging the Future, the Air Ministry and the Advent of All-Metal Aircraft by Matthew Powell. I've done it with Alan Matthews. But I really enjoyed that lecture, Alan. I think it's safe to say you're welcome back here anytime to expand upon it. I think particularly enjoyable to see the dispense aspects of the B-Force being covered. Usually we hear a lot about the offensive side, but have an exploration of defence preparations was very interesting. I'm not going to monopolise the question time because I think it's a topic which a lot of people are going to have questions for you. And the first one, which I think is quite interesting, is on metal fatigue, and it's from Alex Pidd. He's interested in metal fatigue research and how changing modes for the V-Force designed delayed this, and also how info from the likes of the Comet failures were used during this period.
This is not an field of expertise for me, but I think it's worth saying that in the original specifications, the B-35-46 specifications, it was made absolutely clear that these aeroplanes did not need to be strong enough to operate at low level. That's explicit in the specification. And so it probably shouldn't have been any great surprise when the Valiant turned out to have this really serious problem with the main spar in the Valiant. It's interesting to recall that Vickers proposed the B-2 version of the aeroplane, which in fact they built a prototype of, and that was built to a very much stronger specification, which, who knows, but might well have been able to fulfill the low-level role pretty well. As regards the Comet failure, I cannot now remember exactly in which year that occurred, but it was they were in the early 50s, weren't they? 53 or something like that, 52. And the investigation was going on at Farnborough while the first V-bombers were coming into service. So that information was known. The problem there, of course, was the failure of the pressure cabin. And there wasn't any sort of parallel case in the V-bombers. But there I must stop because I really don't have the necessary specialised knowledge.
Okay, brilliant. So we've got a flurry of questions have come in. Fantastic to see. And we have 10 minutes, so I'm going to get into them. Which was the V-Force too little or too late for the investment provided? And should more focus have been on defence?
Too little and too late. Jack Slessor, the Chief of the Air Staff who followed Tedder after the end of the Second World War, was looking, if memory serves me correctly, for 30 squadrons of 8 aircraft. So that would have been 240 bombers. The arguments about the number went on and on and on, and the final force of 144 aircraft, including 104 of the B-2 models, was finally agreed in, if memory serves, 1958. I mean, part of the problem for me was that the decision was not made to choose between the 3 types. And in a way, what a good thing it wasn't made, because if they'd chosen the Valiant, that would have been a problem. But I really think that there was a bit of an element of past experience. You know, what would have happened in the Second World War if they'd chosen the wrong bomber to be the 4-engine bomber. And I think all of that caused a bit of delay. The fact that there were 3 companies involved, I think, must have caused some delay. And of course, the bomb itself wasn't really ready. Although Blue Danubes were delivered to the Air Force in 1953, it wasn't cleared, if I recall correctly, until 1957 for operational use on the aircraft. So in terms of too small and too late, well, very possibly too small, although, of course, the counter-force doctrine went out of the window and was replaced by what people have called the Moscow criterion, where, you know, we needed to be able to persuade people that we could deliver some hydrogen bombs on Moscow. So to achieve that, a smaller number of aircraft would have been required. So my suspicion is that we probably had enough to create a credible deterrent. But all the time that the fighting went on with the Treasury and the Navy and everybody else about how big the force should be cannot have helped in getting the aircraft into service as quickly as we would have liked. I've forgotten the rest of the question, Harry. Have I dealt with it? Time and numbers, I think I've dealt with it.
Yes, I think we'll press on. We've had more questions in the interim. How effective would the Vulcan electronic countermeasure systems have been to counter the threat of Soviet missiles?
In the high-level role and early on, from what I understand, probably quite effective. In the low-level role, much less so, I think, because the area of coverage, as I understand it, would have been much less. I have to say that area of research lies ahead of me. So again, I'm not really qualified to say. But one of the benefits in the early era of high altitude approach would have been that there would have been quite big numbers of bombers all emitting their jamming signals, both to radars and to communications. And that would have caused a pretty big fuzz for both radar and communications. So I think it probably would have been quite effective, but I'll hope to have more to say on that in a year or so. But as I say, in the later period, I suspect probably not terribly effective because of the aircraft being near the ground. But on the other hand, near the ground, they probably would have been able to avoid at least some of the hazards en route to their targets.
Okay, so we have a question regarding the relationship between the RAF V Force and the US Air Force. And how was that relationship in the early period?
Well, very early on, I think people talked, but it took a while for there to be a single integrated operating plan, of which the RAF would have formed part. And again, one of the problems of being an older researcher is that my capability of remembering things without looking them up is probably not as good as it once was. But I think the PSYOP came in 61 or 62. Harry, do you happen to know?
I'm afraid you're out of my period already, Alan. So
yeah, it was thereabouts, I think. But as I understand it, we had a British national targeting plan throughout, which was separate from the single integrated operating plan. And each crew would have had 2 go bags. And if it had been just the British response, then they'd have taken the British target details. And if it were an Allied response, they'd have taken the PSYOP go bag.
Okay. So a question around the early version of the SA2 and a question about its low-level capabilities. Did that lead to the development of the SA3?
It certainly is said not to be been very good at low level. I haven't got my copy of the relevant book beside me, but I'm sure the Soviets realized that they were going to have a problem with low-level attacking aircraft, and so subsequent systems, including, the SA6 comes to mind as well a bit later on, were certainly recognized as being necessary.
So we've got a question here about the feeling of the V-bomber crews on these missions. And was there a sense that they wouldn't be coming back? And if so, how did they feel about that?
Well, I've kept away from oral history, partly because I know that there's another PhD candidate at King's who is looking very specifically at oral history involving V-bomber crews. But I've certainly heard it said that the expectation was that it would be a one-way trip, and I've read that too. And I think the other aspect of this, how people felt about it, was that I think a great many crews didn't really expect it to happen. I remember talking to somebody I met on a visit, a member of a body that I'm a member of, and I asked him that question. How did you feel about it? Did you think it was going to happen? And his initial response was no. Never really thought we were going to have to go and do it. And then he reflected for a moment and he said, well, perhaps sitting in the aeroplane at 15 minutes notice to go during Cuba, yes, perhaps I did think then that we might be going to go and have to do it. I always wonder whether the picture given by that wonderful film, Dr. Strangelove, of the approach of US crews actually rather reflected the attitude that some of them took, with the colonel going out astride the hydrogen bomb at the end of the film. But I don't suppose any of our guys would have done that, even if they had been able to get to the weapon from where they sat. So no, I'm sorry, I don't have a lot on the personnel side because, as I say, I'm steering away from the oral history aspect.
I think that methodologically very wise. It's a minefield.
Yes,
I've also got the image of Slim Pickens as an RAF officer now, which is brilliant. So we've probably got time for two more quick questions. One of which is it's a question about the Canberra and how it's interlaced with the V-Force as a delivery system.
Well, a bomb small enough to fit in the Canberra, of course, didn't come until a bit later because the original bomb was about 5 feet in diameter, so it wouldn't have fitted in the Canberra bomb bay. I believe, although again, it's not my specialist subject, the Canberras that were nuclear armed were so armed after we started cooperating on nuclear matters again with the US from 1958 onwards. And so that they were, I believe, exclusively US weapons. And I don't know whether anybody knows, Group Captain Tom Eales retired, but he was with 16 Squadron on Canberras in Germany. And he describes, interestingly, how the bomb was guarded by American troops and they weren't allowed anywhere near them until the word was given from above that the weapons could be released to be fitted to the aircraft. So that probably kind of defines the relationship between the two.
Okay.
Later on, of course, we had our own weapon, the WE-177, which, although probably owing a good deal to US designs, came along late in the V-bomber era and latterly was cleared for use on a number of different aircraft, including the Tornado, And I believe, actually, even the Sea Harrier was cleared to carry WE-177.
So I think this is going to have to be our last question. Were there any exercises with international partners, for example, Norway, during this period, received bombers?
There certainly were. I mean, Dividend, for example, there were quite a lot of NATO allies taking part. I mean, obviously, we did operate F-86s, for example, but we didn't operate F-84s, so they came from elsewhere within NATO. There's a very interesting aspect connected with Norway, which I've started pursuing, but I haven't yet got anything really useful to say about it, except that I've got some very interesting characters in the Norwegian defence establishment who are prepared to talk to me about it. So I shall hope to have more to say on that at a later date.
Okay, Alan. Well, that's wonderful. You've teased us throughout this question session with the promise of more, and so I think we'll have to have you back possibly in 2022.
Well, I'm sorry to have to tease. I'm sorry not yet to be the complete master of all my subject, but I've got a few years to go until I've got to present the thesis.
Absolutely. Well, I'm looking forward to reading it already. I think that all that's left is to say thank you again, and I know that's a thought that our audience will echo. So thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you.